Good morning. Good morning. Happy No King's Day. Where are Gary and Mary?
We can wait a little bit.
Yeah.
California cash in here, right? You like that, right?
You know, that's kind of part of my talk, actually. I hope that we can, I hope we can put that in there. It's so amazing to be here. It's really so wonderful. Thank you, Bill, and everyone, Roger, Magnus, James, and of course, all the participants. I love you all. It's just really fantastic. And while I'm on the subject, we have such an international panel this morning, and a kind of, we have some international presence all around at the conference. Our particular panel happens to be quite international. Abhijit from India, Sebastian from Poland, myself here from France, a native Californian, a very casual one. I'm even going to take my jacket off later. So you're all welcome to France. Some of you might know that I have a artist residency there, just outside of Paris in the Fontainebleau Forest, called The Library, and you're welcome there. You're really welcome. All right, wonderful. I'm now going to introduce myself, and you can put up my presentation because the first slide is a bit of an introduction to me. I admit I've been struggling with understanding my Henry Miller from my before days and now, and thinking of the 21st century. I have two small children, as many of you know now, because I've been chatting quite a bit, ages 9 and 12. And I moved away from Henry Miller for many reasons. And so before I continue, I brought this up yesterday. If you've not read Juna Barnes' Nightwood, published in 1936, that's probably the best book of the 20th century, and if you haven't laid your eyes on it, you must. And so this is going to roll into what I have to say. So you may know that I'm also a novelist. You may or may not know that I was born in prison, and I was raised poor, very poor, and not by my parents, and that I have a giant hillbilly family. So I want to explain today how I invented my own 1980s version of white trash feminism as a kid, or maybe we can call it survival feminism, which meant being a tomboy, and later in college it meant being cool with the guys, or being one of the boys, not being feminine, but being tough, and actually not really recognizing so much the absence of women in literature and or joining in the valorization of mostly male writers, and that female writers were in fact female writers. Male writers are just writers. And writers are by default male, as is any other non-overtly female presenting anything, including dogs and frogs and stuffed animals, unless it's a boat or a car or some other male joy toy. So this is all bullshit. And I'm glad the new feminism of my daughters is embracing a different kind of radical understanding, and it's not just women who need to be making a stink about it, and also not be gaslit for doing it, and how a woman can't actually take it easy or stop nagging or be casual or not be a bitch when confrontational. Lots of air quotes in there. Why? Because it's always in the woman's court to raise herself up against the patriarchy that can remain complacent and casual and laid back because you've got nothing to lose if you're a man. So that's where my 1980s survival feminism steps in and says, well, I can laugh at this. But can we really? When it means some randos grabbing your body at parties or always being related to in terms of your body and the role of your body to a man and pretending it's funny to survive because I'm one of the guys, right? Is that what I'm supposed to pass on to my little girls? Okay. Wait, I'm the slide controller for now. Okay, so a quick pause. I want to mention that I am heavily involved in a charity called AFSO, Afghan Female Student Outreach, where we offer all volunteer professors online courses to women in Afghanistan. So just a little plug, if you're interested in supporting that, check out afsousa.org. That's just a little advertisement. But obviously very related to what I'm talking about, which is a bit outside of what I've usually talked about in Miller. So these are the couple of books I've written on Miller that you may or may not be familiar with. I'm going to talk about that a little bit too and sort of reconnect with myself. And I also, you may know that I'm also a novelist. So here I have a ton of slides here that I want you to read in the background. So if we can loop that now, that would be great. I'm not going to read out these quotes. I got a ton of them, and they're just for refreshing us and keeping in mind all of these fantastic passages that are just so endless in Miller. I mean, I wanted to be able to say, okay, why do we love Miller? The funny ones, the deep ones, and so on. So they're going to be looping, and you can think about that as I talk. So that said, I have recently analyzed it as follows. Miller has done fantastic, groundbreaking experiments in literature. He may have used a paradigm, used the tropes of his own life to build those experiments, and never didn't use them, and is guilty of being part of them. And before I simply excuse him for being part of his times, contextualizing him and whatnot, I really do want to add that he has not been apologetic, and he has brazenly used those tropes precisely because they are crude and vile and subhuman and grotesque and emblematic of his attempt to dig into what's possible in literature. Maybe it all didn't come out like a perfect symphony, but we can't actually fault him for that because there is so much to admire for the gesture of failing itself. He did cross the line, and that does require examining anew. That's my feeling. Some parts of Sexus you cannot read without holding your eyes behind your hands and turning the page without finishing. I don't know if the men know that's the case, but I think all the women know what I'm talking about there. So I want to tell you how it started and how it's going. Some time ago, doing my PhD, I discovered that reading Henry Miller, when you read the hundreds of books that you do when you're in the short period preparing for your PhD exams, made me laugh out loud. I think many Miller fans can identify with that. I hope some of you can identify with that. How and why does he make us laugh? I mean, that's all it took for me. I'm writing about Miller, he made me laugh. Miller's writing offers something quite different from what the reader usually anticipates in the text. So I want to go now deeper into that philosophical connection. I talk a lot about Maurice Blanchot and also Deleuze. So here I want to talk about Blanchot. This is in my own words. In the everyday use of language, words are the vehicles of ideas. Okay, we're all together there. The word flower means flower that refers to flowers in the world. Everybody still with me there? No doubt it is possible to read literature in this way, but literature is more than this everyday use of language. For in literature, flower does not just mean flower, but many things. And it can do so because the word is independent from what it signifies. This independence, which is passed over in the everyday use of language, is the negativity at the heart of language. The word means something because it negates the physical reality of the thing. It pushes it away. It makes room for more words. There are always more words. That's the point. So literature, as a certain mode of language, tries to explain this phenomenon by producing an image of the world that can theorize the problem of language, but it too is within the same system that cannot unground itself. Writing grapples. It doesn't reveal, and that is Miller's playground. The violence of writing, that is the secret or invisible violence, calls for an undoing of this discourse that seeks to install us in a sense of complete understanding. When you read the news, right, you think you've got something now. When you read literature, it's something else. You cannot perform it in the same way. So Deleuze says, the great books make us laugh. And he refers to maybe, Kafka, Nietzsche, Beckett, because they do not attempt to cast their gaze into what he calls the whole tragedy of interiority. All great books bring about a transmutation. One cannot help but laugh when the codes are confounded. I dare say Miller's significance is laughter and not meaning. Writing is not truth-making, and Miller is having a jolly old time showing us that. So Blanchot has this essay, The Gaze of Orpheus, which gives us the writer as the master of meaning, but as someone condemned to failure, drawn irresistibly to that which cannot be shown, said, or brought into light. Orpheus looks back because he must. To confirm Eurydice's existence, though, is to negate her existence. The desire that drives the artist is precisely the desire to confirm the existence of the thing, but what remains is unreachable. Eurydice, who vanishes the moment he turns. It's a myth about writing itself. The ever-receding horizon, the displacement of meaning at every word on the page. This gesture of doomed necessity defines literature at its edge. With Miller, he is not simply writing to celebrate life or even to represent it. He is writing through the failure to represent it, to be represented. He wants to squish, thrust, force life into literature, but he knows it won't fit. You're licked before you start. The tension, that gap, that madness is the site of his writing. Like Blanchot's Orpheus, Miller looks into the abyss, knowing that the object of desire, whether it's woman, experience, or life itself, will disappear in the act of looking, and still he looks. Still he writes. Still he fails. It is about impossibility as the engine of literature. Miller's grotesque excuses are not just transgressions. They are the evidence of literature straining against its own conditions, trying to become life, and failing again and again. I hope I got the one in there about the toenail. Yes. Okay, good. Love that one. And that failure is not incidental. It is the subject of his work. Like Orpheus, Miller loses Eurydice, not because he looked, but because looking is what literature tries to do. And it always looks too late. Miller, like Orpheus, fails. He fails to render life into literature, just as Orpheus fails to retrieve Eurydice. And like Orpheus, Miller insists on trying anyway. He writes out of the impossibility of his task, the impossibility of making life speak in the language of literature. But here is where the myth and the metaphor it sustains must be interrogated anew. Because what is the cost of this metaphor? Who gets to fail? And who gets turned into the thing failed upon? Eurydice is voiceless, passive, and projected upon. She is the negative space against which the male artist defines his longing. She is the object that is desired and lost. This is so boring. In Blanchot's rendering, Eurydice becomes the absolute figure of absence, the unknowable darkness at the heart of artistic creation. But from a feminist standpoint, we must ask, why is the woman always the absence? Why must she be lost in order for the man to write? And there are some great critiques on this. Carol Ann Duffy, Margaret Atwood, Sarah Rule. Why are we always hearing from men? Why is the default always from the man's perspective? These reimaginings ask us to see the entire Orpheus paradigm, the failed artist, the silenced muse, is itself structured by patriarchy. It enshrines a model of art where male failure is tragic and noble, and female presence is instrumental or expendable. And so, returning to Miller, we must ask, what does it mean that his books are full of women who are unnamed, brutalized, made grotesque, and yet are the very material through which he attempts to reach literature's limits? If we read Miller through Blanchot, we understand the failure. And that's what I did my PhD on. But if we read Blanchot through feminist critique, we begin to see that this structure of failure is not neutral. It's gendered. It turns women into metaphors so that men may become artists. This doesn't mean we must reject Miller or Orpheus or Blanchot, but it does mean that we cannot accept the myth on its own terms. We must understand how the myth writes women out, how it silences Eurydice, even as it mourns her, right? The pedestal is not the place for the woman. What happens then if we let Eurydice write? The man can't do that, of course, but the buck stops here. Miller, unfortunately, was a man, so he has his limitations. What can you do? We don't forgive him, but we learn from him. He is a product of his system. He worked pretty hard to thrash against it, laugh at it, but he remained within it. What happens if the voice that comes from the underworld isn't the artist's lament, but the rejection of the artist's right to lament her? That is the feminist refusal. And it doesn't just reverse the myth, it exposes the system that made the myth necessary in the first place. So, very important, Miller's engagement with misogyny or sexism, with obscenity, vulgarity, even dehumanization, is not a blind reproduction of the world around him, but a conscious confrontation with it. He doesn't pretend to stand outside it, to be pure or enlightened or removed from the systems he writes about. Instead, he deliberately immerses himself in the most degraded, grotesque, and offensive aspects of everyday life, not to affirm them, but to make them squirm inside the confines of literature, sort of bringing these together. Does it work? Not always. And again, it doesn't absolve him from crossing the line and being another tool of the patriarchy, but this is the raw material he has, the decrepit, the vile, the crude, and he refuses to beautify it or elevate it into some idealized notion of literature with a capital L. In fact, what Miller is doing is tearing down the ivory tower of literature as transcendence. He rejects the idea that literature must aspire to refinement or moral clarity. He writes to expose the failed promise of literature to represent life. And in doing so, he stages a spectacle of that failure. His literary experiment is not about taste or success or redemption. It is about watching literature flail under the pressure of the real, watching it squirm and sweat and become distorted in its attempt to contain what it cannot hold. Sexism in this framework is not merely thematic, it's a structural system of the world Miller is writing from and against. He doesn't erase it to preserve literature's dignity. He drags it in, forces literature to grapple with it, and dares literature to survive it. This is not an excuse or to absolve Miller, but to recognize that his project is not literary in the traditional sense. It is, as we've heard, anti-literary or perhaps hyper-literary in the Blanchottian sense, a gob of spit in the face of art. Always writing toward what cannot be written, forcing literature to confront its own collapse under the weight of life. Thank you.